The first time I realized my brother was capable of cruelty, he was holding a pen. My name is Lena Duvall, and this is my story. It began, like most modern tragedies, with paperwork. Emails, notarized attachments, the sickly glow of a digital signature scrawled at 3:14 a.m. A transaction so quiet you could miss it if you weren't awake. I wasn't. He was. By dawn, the small craftsman house in South Pasadena, the one I'd spent 8 years renovating, financing, defending, no longer legally belonged to me. The title had slid, with a few electronic swipes, into my brother's name. The irony was that I'd trusted him because he was family, and family was the last thing I had left that wasn't indexed by credit score or subscription plan. My parents were gone, our grandparents reduced to a box of photos and unpaid property taxes. It was supposed to be the two of us now, me and Mark, survivors of a long line of tired people. I'd believed that meant something sacred. It didn't. The day the title company confirmed the transfer, I was sitting in my car outside Trader Joe's, half listening to a podcast about the housing crisis and the myth of the American starter home. The host's voice said something about generational wealth being a fairy tale for millennials, and I laughed so hard I scared myself. Then the email buzzed in, crisp and bureaucratic. Property reassignment completed. Congratulations, Mr. Duvall. I didn't even get a courtesy CC. He took the house, but he hasn't taken the story. That sentence came to me later, like a pulse under my tongue. I didn't know what it meant yet, only that it was the first time I'd felt something like power since everything fell apart. Mark wasn't evil in the cinematic way. He was a software consultant with a neatly trimmed beard and a mortgage that had been quietly bleeding him dry. He'd always been the pragmatic one, the one who said things like, "Equity doesn't care about emotion." When our mother died and left the house to both of us, he suggested selling it immediately and splitting the money. I said no. I said the house was the last piece of her handwriting on the world. He said that was sentimental. I said sentiment was the only currency left that didn't lose value. He smiled, the way you smile at someone drowning while holding a towel. What I didn't know then was that he was already in debt. Crypto losses, credit card advances, a business partnership gone wrong. He forged my digital consent on the sale papers and transferred the deed into a shell LLC. He probably thought I'd never find out until the checks cleared. Maybe he even planned to tell me later, soften it with some plausible story about refinancing. That was Mark's style, half-truths polished until they looked like favors. The betrayal wasn't just about property, it was about reality. When I confronted him, his voice over the phone was maddeningly calm. "You're overreacting, Lena. It's all under control. You'll get your share once I stabilize things." Under control. Stabilize things. Words that mean I've already burned it down. The days after the discovery blurred into fluorescent hours. I was staying in a short-term rental in Echo Park, one of those pastel-painted duplexes that smell faintly of lemon cleaner and old carpet. I'd lost not only my home, but the narrative of myself. The woman who cooked in that kitchen, who painted those window frames white, who kept a basil plant alive for 2 years, that woman was gone. What remained was a version of me stripped for parts. I worked remotely for a marketing firm, drafting Instagram captions for eco-conscious detergent brands. My boss, Alana, texted me, "You good to handle the March content push?" I typed sure and stared at the blinking cursor. The world goes on selling things while you're breaking. Everywhere I looked, houses were vanishing, bulldozed for condos, converted to Airbnbs, repossessed by banks. Mark hadn't just stolen from me, he'd joined the larger theft of a country eating itself alive. At night, I scrolled Zillow the way other people doom scroll Twitter. I'd zoom in on the house, my house, as if the photos might still remember me. The front porch lights still worked. The jasmine I planted still climbed the railing. A stranger had already toured it. The listing boasted, freshly updated interior by local craftsmen. That local craftsman was me. I drove by once. The for sale sign leaned slightly toward the sidewalk. Through the living room window, I could see the outline of my mother's old sofa. He hadn't even moved it out yet. I sat in the car and watched the blinds glow with the dying sun, like the house was holding its breath. When you lose something foundational, your mind starts replaying small betrayals you once excused. The time he borrowed $500 from our joint inheritance fund. The time he used my social security number to get a better interest rate. The way he'd smile when I said I couldn't afford therapy, as if mental health was a luxury product. It's strange how betrayal doesn't hit all at once. It unfolds like mold, invisible until it's everywhere. I told no one for weeks. Shame kept me quiet. In America, losing your house feels like a moral failure, as if debt is a mirror of your worth. I kept imagining people whispering, "She couldn't keep up. She let it slip away." But one night, while doom scrolling through social media, I stumbled on a video essay about narrative revenge, how women throughout history have reclaimed power through storytelling, through reframing. The phrase reclaiming the story caught like a match. That was when the idea began to form, not fully, but as an ember. Still, I wasn't ready. Not yet. I had to understand the wound before I could weaponize it. I started digging. Mark's finances were tangled, but I was good at research. He'd always mocked my English major instincts, but it turned out critical reading applies just fine to corporate filings. I found the LLC registered to a P.O. box in Glendale. I found unpaid property taxes under its name. I found screenshots of him bragging in a private Facebook group about a killer real estate flip. He wasn't even subtle. Every discovery was a small electric thrill, a pulse of fury disguised as clarity. I kept a notebook titled Evidence, though I didn't yet know what I'd do with it. Maybe I thought if I documented enough, the universe would correct itself. Maybe I was just afraid of forgetting. In early spring, he listed the house for $1.2 million, double what we inherited it for. The market was rabid. Bidding wars, cash offers, buyers from Texas and China. The idea that strangers would walk through my rooms made me sick. I couldn't stop picturing their shoes grinding against the hardwood I'd refinished myself. That's when I called him again. He didn't answer. So I texted, "We need to talk. You can't sell what isn't yours." He replied an hour later, "Stop making this dramatic. You'll get your cut." Cut, as if he were slicing me open. The first night I couldn't sleep, I drove to the coast. Santa Monica Pier, late, when the tourists are gone and the wind tastes like metal. I sat on a bench and watched the lights flicker off one by one. That's when the refrain came back, whispering inside me, shaping itself into something sharper. He took the house, but he hasn't taken the story. This time it didn't sound like consolation. It sounded like a plan. I began to imagine ways to make the story public, not in the cheap viral way, but something lasting. A legal truth dressed as a confession. A piece of writing that could survive him, survive me, maybe even survive property law. I thought about the essays I used to read in The Atlantic, about the rise of sibling estrangement, about how money corrodes intimacy. What if I wrote one? What if I told everything, not as revenge, but as witness? But that was still months away. For now, I just drove home, if you can call a month-to-month rental home, and opened my laptop. The screen reflected my face, tired, furious, alive. That was the end of everything I'd been and the beginning of something else. Something colder, something that could plan. To be continued in part 2. Planning. The morning after I decided to fight back, I woke with a strange calm. It wasn't peace exactly, more like a clarity that had waited years for its turn. I made coffee in the rental kitchen, the cheap kind that leaves a plastic aftertaste, and watched the light bleed through the blinds. The world outside moved in the same indifferent rhythm. Trash trucks, leaf blowers, the faint freeway moan. It was absurd how the world didn't pause for private revolutions. But maybe that was what made them real. The small decision to act, unnoticed. I started by calling the county clerk. The woman on the phone had the soft, detached tone of someone who'd seen too many people lose everything through signatures. I explained what had happened, how my brother had forged consent, transferred ownership, and sold our mother's house without my knowledge. She said politely, "You'll need an attorney." Of course. America's favorite answer to everything broken. Hire someone. I didn't have the money. My savings had evaporated between rent and credit card interest. The only asset I had left was my story, and that wasn't collateral. Not yet. That week, I began keeping a second notebook, Blueprint. The first notebook, Evidence, was for facts. The second was for imagination. In it, I wrote every possible angle of revenge, testing them like hypotheses. Sue him. Leak his financials anonymously to his business partners. Publish an essay exposing the theft. Write a novel based on the truth. Record everything and make a podcast. I crossed out the first two. I couldn't afford a lawyer, and the thought of anonymous revenge felt cowardly. What I wanted was ownership, not just of the house, but of the narrative. A kind of poetic equity. But to tell the story publicly, I'd have to gather more than emotion. I'd need proof. Emails, bank transfers, screenshots, the full anatomy of betrayal. So I started visiting the house again. Not inside. He'd changed the locks, but outside at night when the street was quiet and the air smelled faintly of jasmine and car exhaust. I'd sit across the street in my car, notebook in hand, and document every detail. The new security lights, the sound of sprinklers, the moving van that arrived one Sunday morning. Observing became my discipline. Each entry felt like reclaiming a small piece of it, word by word. Sometimes I'd whisper to the dark, "You don't get to erase me." In early May, he put the house into escrow. A young couple from Seattle had offered full cash, no contingencies. That's when the real plan took shape. I realized that once the sale finalized, there'd be a trail. Contracts, disclosure statements, wire transfers, all public record. If I could trace the forgery to those documents, I could expose him. But exposure alone wasn't enough. I didn't want to destroy him only legally. I wanted him to feel what he'd made me feel. Small, unmoored, dependent on public mercy. So I started a new file on my computer, Inheritance. It looked like a memoir draft, but really it was bait. I began writing the story of us, two siblings in the aftermath of loss, struggling to keep a family home. I wrote with tenderness, almost generosity, because I knew he'd read it eventually. I emailed him a version one night, pretending it was a peace offering. "Mark," I typed, "I'm writing about Mom, about the house. Maybe it could help both of us heal." He responded within an hour. "Do what you want, just don't drag my name into it." That line, "do what you want," was the permission I didn't need but took anyway. By midsummer, I was living in what felt like a permanent state of rehearsal. Every conversation, every gesture became part of the script. I researched defamation law, copyright protections, whistleblower statutes. I learned how to anonymize a story just enough to stay legal while leaving no doubt who it was about. Writing became the weapon I could wield without leaving fingerprints. But revenge wasn't the only current moving through me. There was grief, too. Slow, tidal, returning whenever I smelled lemon cleaner or heard wind against blinds. Sometimes I'd find myself halfway through a paragraph and suddenly remember the night our mother died. How Mark had held her hand and promised to look after everything. And he had, technically. Just not in the way she meant. Grief has a way of disguising itself as strategy. One night, I attended a literary reading downtown, something I hadn't done in years. The venue was a converted warehouse, all concrete and exposed brick, filled with people wearing thrifted sincerity. The featured author read an essay about debt and belonging, about how the modern economy weaponizes family obligation. It felt like she was speaking directly to me. Afterward, I introduced myself. Her name was Sari. She was kind in that weary, knowing way writers sometimes are. I told her I was working on something about inheritance and betrayal. She said, "Write the wound, not the weapon." That line stayed with me. It wasn't advice, it was a challenge. For weeks, I wrestled with it. Was I writing from the wound or the weapon? Did I want justice or just to be seen? In truth, I wanted both. Meanwhile, Mark was living the American dream, or at least pretending to. His social media filled with posts about entrepreneurial success and the power of strategic risk. There were photos of him at open houses, smiling beside realtors, holding champagne flutes. I studied those photos the way detectives study crime scenes. One image showed him in front of the house, the jasmine blooming behind him. His caption read, "Sometimes letting go means leveling up." I stared at that line until my hands shook. Then I saved the photo to my desktop, renamed it Exhibit A, and returned to my document. I began writing faster, harder, no longer for catharsis, but for precision. I described the betrayal in clinical detail, the forged signatures, the emails, the silence. I layered it with reflections on the housing crisis, on sibling rivalry, on the moral thinness of ambition. It wasn't just our story anymore. It was America's. By August, I had nearly 60 pages. The essay moved between memory and indictment, grief and indictment, love and indictment, always circling the same truth. That property isn't just land, it's the narrative of who belongs and who gets erased. Then something strange happened. The essay went viral before I even finished it. I'd submitted a shorter excerpt to an online magazine under a pseudonym, mostly to test my voice. I didn't expect anyone to read it. But within days, it spread across social media. People quoted lines, debated them in comment sections, argued about the ethics of family and money. Someone even started a Reddit thread titled, "He Took the House, but Not the Story." The refrain had escaped me and become a slogan. When I saw those words trending, I felt a rush of triumph, and then immediately, fear. I hadn't named him, but it wouldn't take long for people to connect the dots. We shared a surname, a history, a city. In the age of digital transparency, anonymity is just delayed exposure. Sure enough, he called 2 nights later. His voice was sharp with disbelief. "Did you write that article?" "People are messaging me. My clients saw it." I said evenly, "I told the truth." He said, "You're destroying my reputation." I said, "You destroyed our family." Then silence, long, jagged. I could hear him breathing. Finally, he said, "You think words can hurt me?" And I said, "Watch me." That was when I knew I'd crossed from planning into execution, though I didn't admit it yet. There's a moment in every act of revenge when morality becomes optional, replaced by momentum. I was no longer the victim of his theft. I was the author of his undoing. The next day, I signed a small publishing contract. The magazine wanted a full-length essay expansion, possibly a book. They offered a modest advance, barely a month's rent, but it wasn't about money. It was about validation. The editor wrote, "Your story captures something essential about this country's quiet betrayals." Quiet betrayals. Yes, that was the point. I spent the following weeks refining the manuscript. I stripped away sentimentality, leaving only bone. I included excerpts of emails, rephrased enough to avoid legal exposure, but clear enough that anyone could read between the lines. I painted him not as a villain, but as a symptom, a man infected by the myth of perpetual growth. Every line was true, but truth is still a weapon when aimed right. One afternoon, as the August heat shimmered over the freeway, I received a cease and desist letter from his lawyer. It was laughably performative, phrases like defamatory insinuation and malicious intent. But something in me hesitated. For the first time, I wondered if I'd gone too far. Then I looked at my bank account, 3 digits, all red, and remembered that hesitation is a privilege of the unbroken. I sent the letter to my editor, who forwarded it to the magazine's legal team. They reviewed it and replied simply, "We stand by the story." That night, I opened a bottle of cheap wine, sat on the floor, and reread the essay from start to finish. It felt like holding a mirror I'd been avoiding. Every paragraph glowed with quiet rage, but underneath it was grief, still alive and pulsing. I whispered to the empty room, "He took the house, but he hasn't taken the story." This time the word sounded less like a vow and more like a curse. By early September, the piece went live nationally. It reached millions of readers in a week. Talk shows discussed it, podcasts dissected it, influencers quoted it without understanding it. People sent me emails, strangers telling me about their own betrayals, their own brothers, their own losses. Somewhere between catharsis and chaos, I realized the story had stopped belonging to me too. Revenge, once unleashed, obeys no one. Mark's name trended briefly on Twitter after someone linked the LLC records. His company lost clients. His partner left him. Someone vandalized his car, spray-painted thief across the side. I didn't do it, but I can't say I was sorry. The press called it the Duvall affair. Commentators debated whether I was a hero or a monster. I stayed offline for days, paralyzed between guilt and victory. I told myself he deserved it. I told myself this was justice. But when I caught my reflection in the dark laptop screen, I didn't recognize the woman staring back. Eyes bright, sleepless, half feral. The thing about revenge is that it teaches you how similar you are to the person you hate. Autumn crept in. The house finally sold, but at a reduced price. After legal fees and debts, there was almost nothing left for him. I imagined him sitting in some rental apartment, staring at his own blinds, wondering when the noise would stop. Part of me wanted to call. Part of me wanted to ask if he understood yet what it feels like to be erased. But I didn't. Instead, I kept writing. The book proposal expanded into a full memoir, The House That Wasn't Ours. The advance covered my rent for 6 months. People began inviting me to panels about ethical storytelling and digital accountability. They called me brave. I smiled and said thank you, but inside I knew bravery had nothing to do with it. It was hunger. the hunger to be believed. Still, at night, the guilt seeped in. I'd dream of our mother standing on the porch, her face half in shadow, saying, "You're both my children. Don't turn the house into a weapon." I'd wake with tears on my face and the taste of dust in my mouth. The jasmine outside my window bloomed again, heavy with scent, sweet to the point of nausea. I told myself it was worth it, that every story has a price, and this was mine. But sometimes, when the freeway hummed like a restless heart and the city lights flickered through the blinds, I wondered if I'd built a new prison out of the ruins of the old one. I'd won, technically. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that he still held something I couldn't reclaim, the version of me before all this began. When you've already ruined someone publicly, there's an expectation that you stop. That's the ethical boundary people like to believe in, the point where justice turns to cruelty. But revenge, once it gathers momentum, doesn't stop. It evolves. For me, it turned digital. The memoir deal had brought me attention. But attention is a currency that demands renewal. If you don't keep feeding it, it devours you instead. So I began documenting the process online, not the betrayal itself anymore, but the aftermath, the healing, the rebuilding. People love redemption arcs. They're easier to digest than the truth that no one really heals. We just learn to carry what's broken more efficiently. I started a Substack newsletter called The House Files. It wasn't about Mark directly, not at first. It was about property, power, and the invisible debts between family members. I wrote weekly essays about things like credit scores, eviction moratoriums, and the psychology of ownership. I quoted economists and poets in the same paragraph. It grew fast, thousands of subscribers, enough to pay rent without the marketing job I'd already quietly quit. But each essay carried a coded message, an undercurrent he would recognize. He had once taken the house. Now I was taking the narrative infrastructure that justified people like him, the real execution. Not a single strike, but a slow reinfiguration of the world around him. In October, a journalist reached out. She wanted to write a feature about the woman who exposed familial theft in the age of digital confession. I hesitated, but something in me, the same something that had whispered "watch me" months before, said yes. Her name was Nadia Chen, and she arrived one gray morning at the cafe down the street, notebook in hand, polite but sharp-eyed. We sat by the window. She ordered an oat milk latte. I ordered black coffee, my hand trembling slightly as I lifted it. She asked about guilt. She asked if I regretted how far it went. I said that truth doesn't owe politeness. She smiled, but her eyes recorded more than her pen did. Afterward, she sent me a draft of the piece before it ran. It was fair, balanced even, but one line struck me cold. In punishing her brother, Lena Duvall became the kind of myth that America loves, a woman who turns pain into property. I stared at that sentence for a long time. Pain into property. It wasn't wrong. The article went live a week later. Overnight, my subscriber count doubled again. Book sales surged. A small production company contacted me about optioning film rights. People called me a literary avenger. They used words like iconic and fearless. But fame is just another form of debt. You keep paying with new pieces of yourself. I tried not to Google him, but of course I did. Mark had deleted his social media. The LLC was dissolved. His LinkedIn listed him as consultant, seeking new opportunities. He was living in Arizona now, renting, working remotely for some startup that didn't mind the controversy. Part of me wanted to send him the article, to underline that line, pain into property, and ask if he understood now how theft mutates. Instead, I stayed quiet. Silence was a new kind of power. By winter, the book was finished. The final chapter closed not with triumph, but with ambiguity. I wrote that revenge isn't about victory, but the redistribution of meaning. My editor called it haunting. I thought it was just honest. The week it went to print, I received a handwritten letter. No return address, but I knew the handwriting immediately. Lena, you got what you wanted. Congratulations. I hope it fills whatever hole you were digging into when you decided to destroy me. I don't hate you anymore. That's the worst part. I understand you. Maybe we're both just paying off the same debt in different ways. Mark. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the evidence notebook. For days, I couldn't bring myself to write anything else. Understanding is a more devastating weapon than hatred. January came with rain, weeks of it. The kind that turns Los Angeles gray and rinsed, as if the city itself is exhausted by pretending to shine. The roof of my rental leaked near the window. I kept a bowl underneath to catch the slow, deliberate drips. Each sound reminded me of time passing. Patient, indifferent, irreversible. I was supposed to be drafting a new essay about post-revenge identity, but I couldn't focus. Instead, I found myself opening the old Zillow listing again. The house was off-market now, but the cached images remained. The porch, the blinds, the kitchen tile I'd chosen. I zoomed in until the pixels blurred and whispered, "He took the house, but he hasn't taken the story." But this time it sounded hollow, because maybe, finally, I wasn't sure who he was anymore, or whether the story was still mine. One evening, I got an email from a stranger, a woman named Janine, who introduced herself as Mark's neighbor in Arizona. She wrote that she was sorry if this was intrusive, but my brother mentioned me once. He wasn't well, she said. He'd lost his job again. Sometimes he sat outside late, just staring at the desert. He said I was the only one who ever won. She thought I should know. I read the message twice, then shut my laptop. The rain was still falling. I sat in the dim light, listening to the steady tap against the window pane, and felt something thaw. Pity, maybe, or fatigue. Winning had never felt this heavy. The book launched in March. The event was held in a downtown gallery, all exposed beams and string lights, the kind of space that makes struggle look aesthetic. My editor introduced me as a voice of the generation betrayed by its own bloodlines. People clapped. I smiled, answered questions, signed copies, took photos under soft lighting. But halfway through, I saw someone standing near the back, tall, wearing a gray jacket. For a moment, my heart stopped. It wasn't him, of course. Just a stranger with the same posture, the same quiet intensity. But my hands trembled so badly I had to set the pen down. Later that night, alone, I scrolled through the event photos online. In every image, I was smiling. No one could tell my chest felt hollowed out, like a house gutted for renovation. That's the problem with turning your pain into narrative. You start living for the symmetry instead of the truth. Spring arrived, and with it, noise. Interviews, invitations, panels. Everyone wanted the woman who made revenge literary. On stage, I performed the persona they expected. Poised, articulate, tragic, but triumphant. I quoted Baldwin and Didion, talked about moral complexity, performed humility. The applause was always warm, the questions reverent. Yet each time I stepped off the stage, I felt smaller, as if the performance had stolen another inch of my real self. Sometimes I'd return home, open the fridge, and just stand there, staring at the dull light on the milk carton, realizing I hadn't eaten all day. People kept saying, "You're free now." But freedom, I'd learned, is just the moment between one story ending and another beginning to trap you. In late April, I was invited to speak at a university symposium on narrative, justice, and social repair. I flew to Chicago. The campus was all brick and budding trees, the air sharp with spring. During the panel, a student asked whether revenge can ever coexist with empathy. I said it can try. Then, after a pause, I said empathy doesn't erase what was taken. It just makes the taking bearable to remember. Afterward, a professor approached me privately. She said my brother must be furious, but also oddly proud. I laughed politely, but the words hit deeper than she knew. Immortalized him. Yes, revenge preserves the thing you want to destroy. That night in the hotel room, unable to sleep, I opened my email. Another message from Janine. He moved out. Said he was going back to California for a while. Didn't say why. I closed the laptop and stared at the dark. For the first time in months, I was afraid. He showed up 2 days later. Not at my apartment, at the cafe down the street, the same one where I'd met the journalist months before. I saw him through the window as I walked by. Older, thinner, his beard streaked with gray. He looked up and saw me. Our eyes met. I froze. He motioned to the empty chair across from him. I don't know what made me go inside. Maybe curiosity. Maybe guilt. Maybe the simple gravity of shared history. We didn't speak for a while. Just sat there, the air thick with the smell of burnt espresso and rain-soaked pavement. Finally, he said he wasn't there to fight. I said nothing. He said I won, that I got everything, that he just wanted me to know he was sorry. Still nothing. Then he said I wrote the story well. That was the moment I realized he'd read the book. All of it. We sat in silence again. The cafe's hum filled the space between us. The hiss of the steamer, the clink of cups, a song playing too softly to identify. He said Mom would have hated this. I said she'd have hated what you did. He nodded slowly. Maybe, he said, but she'd still hate what you became. That one landed. He stood to leave, then hesitated, looking down at me with something close to pity. He said I could have the last word. I always did. And then he walked out. I didn't cry. Not right away. I went home, sat on the floor again, and opened my notebook. For the first time in months, the pages felt foreign, like artifacts from another life. I tried to write, but the words came out brittle. Later that night, I dreamed of the house. In the dream, it wasn't sold or broken. It was just standing there, untouched, lights glowing softly through the blinds. I walked inside. Every room smelled faintly of rain and lemon cleaner. Mark was there too, painting a wall. He turned and said we could have shared it, you know. I woke up gasping, the sound of distant traffic humming like surf. The next morning, I drafted a new essay. It wasn't about him this time. It was about silence, about how stories once told keep echoing whether or not you keep speaking. It ended with a line I didn't expect. He took the house, but maybe I gave him the story. When I reread it, my throat tightened. It was the first honest thing I'd written in months. The weeks after Mark's visit felt suspended, like the world had turned down its volume. Every sound seemed slightly distant. The click of my phone charging, the low rush of traffic through the open window, the faint hiss of rain on the street below. I stopped posting for a while. The newsletter went silent. My readers flooded my inbox with concern. Was I okay? Was I working on something new? They wanted the next chapter of redemption, not the quiet truth that sometimes there is no next chapter. Just the sound of breathing, the weight of what you've already done. I spent hours walking through my neighborhood, past rows of pastel houses with succulents in their yards, past children on scooters, past dogs pulling their owners forward. Everything looked newly vivid, as if grief had sharpened my eyesight. The smell of drier heat from a laundromat vent, the tang of rain hitting asphalt, the faint trace of lemon from a nearby car wash. Ordinary things, too beautiful to trust. One afternoon, I wandered into a thrift store and found a ceramic house, a crude little sculpture, chipped and uneven. Someone had painted it decades ago, maybe a child. I bought it for $1 and set it on my desk. Sometimes I'd stare at it while I worked, half hoping it would crack and reveal something inside. I told myself I was done with revenge, but revenge is like interest on an unpaid loan. It keeps accruing in silence. It doesn't need action anymore, just presence. It becomes the lens through which you see everything. In April, my publisher sent royalty statements. The numbers were good, too good. The kind of success that should have felt triumphant. Instead, I stared at the zeros and felt a slow nausea rise. All that money came from pain, from the wound turned outward, from a brother's failure turned consumable. I tried to send some of it to him anonymously, a wire transfer through a mutual contact, but it bounced back, unclaimed. He must have known. Maybe that was his final boundary. Maybe that was his revenge. I began teaching workshops. Narrative ethics, autofiction, the politics of truth. Students leaned forward, notebooks open, eyes wide. They wanted formulas for transforming suffering into art. I told them there were none. That sometimes the story takes more than it gives. A girl in the front row once asked if I forgave him. The room went still. I said forgiveness isn't a finish line. It's a horizon. You walk toward it until you can't anymore. Then you live where you stopped. That night, I walked home along the freeway overpass. The noise below was endless, hypnotic, cars streaming like silver veins. I leaned on the railing and let the wind sting my face. For a moment, I thought of calling him, just to hear his voice again, to ask if he ever dreamed about the house too. I didn't. Months passed. The book became a college syllabus topic. Critics called it a contemporary classic. My face appeared on panels and podcasts, yet each public moment felt less like a victory and more like an echo of something that had already rotted. One evening, after an event in Santa Monica, I checked into a hotel overlooking the ocean. The air smelled of salt and eucalyptus. The curtains swayed gently in the sea breeze. I poured a glass of cheap white wine, opened my laptop, and found a new email from Janine. She wrote that Mark had been in an accident. A drunk driver, late at night. It wasn't fatal, but serious. He was in a rehabilitation center outside Phoenix. He'd asked if I might visit. For a long time, I just sat there, the screen's light trembling on my hands. Then I closed the laptop and stared at the black window, where my reflection floated above the night ocean. I thought about the word repair. How it sounds gentle, domestic, as if anything broken can be fixed with enough patience. But some things, once fractured, become a different shape entirely. Still, I flew out. The rehab facility was surrounded by desert, endless beige and brittle air. He looked smaller, lighter, as if someone had erased the edges around him. We talked for an hour. It wasn't dramatic, just tired words. He said he didn't blame me. I said I didn't blame him anymore either, though I wasn't sure that was true. When I left, he smiled faintly, told me to keep writing. On the plane home, I watched the land flatten beneath the clouds. I felt neither relief nor regret, just an odd stillness, like water settling after a storm. Back in Los Angeles, I unpacked and found the little ceramic house had cracked down the middle. A clean, delicate split. I didn't glue it. I placed both halves side by side on the desk, their interiors hollow and pale. That night, I sat down and wrote again. Not an essay, not a confession, just something for myself. The words came slowly, uncertainly, but they came. He took the house, but he hasn't taken the story. The refrain still carried a pulse, but this time it didn't sound like triumph or defiance. It sounded like surrender, like the moment you finally admit that stories don't save you. They just keep you company while you learn how to live with what's gone. Outside, the freeway hummed, a siren wailed and faded. Somewhere, rain began again, light and steady. I closed my laptop, lay back, and let the sound fill the room until it was the only thing left.